we are not even in the middle, I think, of our event, so there is still much more to come. And now I'm really happy to welcome you to our first panel, Small Players Guiding the Way to Global Change. We have 45 minutes with 3 really interesting speakers, so I'm trying to do my best to briefly introduce them and then jump straight into our conversation. So it's my great pleasure to have Bas van Abel with us. Marie already mentioned him as he's also an Ashoka Fellow. He is a Dutch designer, an engineer, and entrepreneur, and he's best known for being the founder of Fairphone, a sustainable smartphone manufacturer and a social enterprise that designs and creates smartphones that really try to have a lower environmental impact. Since 2018, he's not the CEO anymore, but he's still on the board and he's focusing very much on the strategy. And at the same time, he's also founded another startup, actually a circular startup called The Click, which is trying to transform organic resources from urban environments into new products again. So I'm happy to have you with us, Bas. Hi. Our second speaker is Theresa Imre. Theresa is from the Austrian countryside. This is where she grew up. Then she went to Vienna. Hi, Theresa, good to have you. Went to Vienna to study there, started a food blog, which actually got awarded several times at the same time. I'm trying hard to translate the title of your food blog into English. In German, it's eingebrockt und ausgelöffelt. In English, it's somehow a wordplay that in a way means if you get into trouble, you can spoon it out, but I'm sure you will have encountered a better way to translate it. Actually, in parallel to her studies, Theresa started working for a consultancy company that also developed startups. So she was already quite close to the startup scene, which then also led to her coming up and founding her own startup. She did that also while still studying, and the title of her master thesis is also quite interesting, as it is Reinventing Local Food Markets, How Alternative Food Structures Can Break into the Mainstream. And that is basically what Theresa then did with her startup called markta. She founded it in 2015, and what markta is, it's an online market for farmers where, under the motto from farm to fork, they can connect with the final customers and also make sure that their products are marketed well. Good to have you with us, Theresa.
Thank you for inviting me. I'm happy.
And the third one in this great round is Ian Hopday. Ian is originally from England. I'm not mentioning football again, I promise. You have lived and worked in Australia, in France, in US, and in Italy. He has held several CEO roles in different companies in several sectors all over the world. He's got 21 years track record in reconstructing turnarounds and business development, so basically fixing businesses that were broken all over the globe. After more than a decade in the chemical industry, he then decided to pursue his passion and become an angel investor, mentor, and coach for startups with a big focus on renewables, electric vehicles, and energy storage. Great to have you with us, Ian, as well.
Thank you.
So the title of this panel is How Small Players Can Actually Guide the Way to Global Change. And I think Bas and Theresa, you both have a personal story where you actually did just that. And Bas, maybe we can start with you. Coming back to Fairphone, the idea to Fairphone actually came up whilst you were still working in a creative think tank, Dark Society. And I think back then there was the topic was the conflict with minerals in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So then you started Fairphone, and you told me that within the first 1.5 years you made it up to have 40 employees, you sold 60,000 phones, and at one point you were the fastest growing startup in Europe. And you told me that when your enterprise goes bad, it's difficult, but when it goes well, it's even more difficult. So maybe you can tell us a bit from your personal experience with this huge success story that you had with Fairphone.
Yeah, well, first of all, thanks for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here. Yeah, just to go back to how it started, you know, at the point that you were just saying, when we sold 60,000 phones, you know, after 1.5 years, and it was not me and my intern anymore, but it was also 40 people, and we had our management team actually. At that point, I still had no idea what I was doing, to be honest. And that came also by the fact that we kind of took it in a strategically naive way. And I think that, the strategy behind it was that we didn't start Fairphone to set up a company. We wanted to create awareness around problems in Central Africa, specifically on conflicts that are related to the mining of minerals, in which millions of people have died in the last 10, 15 years. So people told us, if you really want to, well, if you go into supply chain of electronics, and it's with clothes, it's with foods, with all these things, but specifically electronics, it's so complex, and we've managed to make it kind of a black box, and people don't really know what's happening behind the scenes. But you're dealing with thousands and thousands of factories. You're dealing with more than 60 minerals in a phone, and before you know it, if you really want to create a fair phone or want to raise awareness around the problems in Africa, the first thing you need to do is to create world peace to solve it, right? So in that kind of context, we took the easy route, which was the strategically naive easy route, which was basically saying, guys, if we want to bring the story all the way to the consumers, we start in the mines in Congo, because that's where stuff comes from. I'm a designer, I'm an artist, I have a design background. And I'm fascinated by the fact that if you just dig into the ground, you find stuff which we can make computers and cameras and everything you're using right now. And that economic system is so sophisticated that it's able to do that. So I wanted to dive into that by making it easy. And the easy part was, let's make a phone, because making phones is already done. And we wanted to see how the world works through the eyes of the phones. And if you look through the eyes of a phone into the world, you basically you see the whole world. And that's the journey that we took off from. And we knew already that we weren't able to create a fully fair phone from the start. Like I said, that would be creating world peace. So, setting up the company was actually just a means to an end, to be able to do what we wanted to do, and that's to create that change from the inside of the economic system.
And it seemed to actually work quite well. So you really were one of those small players who then had major success. And at one point, you were probably overwhelmed by that. So can you tell us a bit about what they did to you personally, how you experienced that sudden success?
Yeah, so well, it's kind of I always compare it to kind of a manic ride, right? You have huge ups and you have huge downs. And the problem with doing something that you've never done before, and that deals 90% of your time, you can compare with flying, just a rocket or a plane that lifted off, and you're still building it, and you don't know how to fly. If you do that, if you stop doing that, you basically crash. So you have to keep going on. You have to keep going on, and if you keep doing that for a very long period, especially with also becoming a symbol of change. Things can start, the pressure can start really, it can start pressing on you. So I was in a situation, and I think many of the entrepreneurs that have been dealing with this, that had success in the eyes of the outside world, is that you start feeling like a fraud. You're on stage, you're a symbol. I've had weird situations that was on stage. Even in Austria, I got this sustainability prize, which was presented, by the president to me, and I was like the first person ever to win this prize nationally, and was like, who am I, right? I was on stage with Nobel Prize winners, with Klaus Schwab from the World Economic Forum, and I was at the same level, and I really had to tell myself I was a symbol of what was happening, and not necessarily it was about me. But again, if that keeps going on, and you keep doing stuff you don't know what you're doing, at a certain point I collapsed at a certain point with my health, and it had several aspects, not only this, but also the financial load, also the fact that I didn't see my kids a lot anymore. I was traveling to China, to Congo. I was partying my ass off because I wanted to just forget about the work once in a while, and and then at a certain point your body says stop.
I think it's really beautiful that you're so outspoken about this, because that was probably one part of success that people don't really have in mind, specifically when it comes to startups. People always just think of the party that you just mentioned, but not of the high pressure and the responsibility that you also have as a founder.
Yeah.
What would you say now, like what would be your advice to the kind of current small players? What would you tell a founder, specifically in the social entrepreneurship scene, what they can do in order to avoid that burnout maybe?
Yeah, well, I think the amount of passion that people have when they go into social entrepreneurship is huge, but it also comes with a burden, and that burden is that you start kind of you have this very symbiotic relationship with your company. When the company goes bad, you go bad, right? And it's kind of the world is going to an end if you don't show the people that what's happening is actually needs to happen. In that sense, it's a lot it's a lot easier probably to start a campaign because with a company you're actually working from within the system that you're trying to change. So you're going to be dictated by the same system that you're trying to change. You have to love that. You really have to love all the dilemmas that come with that. And if you embrace these dilemmas, they become beautiful. Then every conversation you have about, do I need to sell more phones, or do I stop selling more phones because every phone I create, I also destroy. It's just these human dilemmas that normal companies have a very hard time dealing with. So if you see them as problems, it becomes, and wait, then it becomes problematic. So, embrace those dilemmas, I would say, and be able to put yourself in a vulnerable position. You can't do this on your own. You're doing something in a system, and systemic change is about, deals with everything, is about everything. Everything is connected. So, and make that small, make it fun. But one of the things, especially with the company, and I think that has to do with every startup, is try to create a situation in which you always have a way out. It gives you a peace of mind to know that you can always kind of stop or leave it with others that they can continue the journey. And that is, that's a difficult one because it also has to do with ego. It has to do with, all these kind of things. But especially, with my new company, I've started a company with two co-founders, and we kind of designed that whole board because I know I don't want to deal too much with people in operations, from the start. We got somebody with operations, so that really helps. And have a solid financial strategy, I would say, because that is, I think if that works, your life gets a lot easier, and then you also accept the fact that you're also an economic entity.
Great, thank you. I think that was quite a few advices there, and I think we're going to talk about your other venture a bit later as well. I'd like to now talk about a second story that we've got here, Theresa. So I heard from you that you already founded markta in 2015, and
17. 15 was the food blog time, and then we developed it afterwards.
Perfect. And you told me at the beginning it was this kind of online platform, but then the moment when it got started, when it started getting like really, started going up, was when you built this logistical center around it.
Yes.
So, and then COVID hit, and suddenly everyone was at home and wanting to order food online, and also becoming a bit more aware that, local food production might actually be something that we should look into this. So suddenly there was this really big demand for your service and for your product. You told me that within the orders in 1 week went from 150 to 2,500, and the revenue from 90,000 a year to 2.3 million. That is quite a thing for someone who just got it started and who was maybe struggling a bit in the first year. And then suddenly there was also this success. So now we just heard from Bas that this isn't always as shiny as it sounds. Maybe you can tell us from your personal perspective how you experienced that year of crisis that maybe wasn't that much crisis for you, but rather the contrary.
Sure, but actually Bas just spoke from my heart as well. So many aspects that he mentioned, also in terms of funding, organizational structures. So hyper growth, or at least a large amount of growth that you have to deal with if you're not expecting it, is sometimes even more challenging than you think. So I totally feel you, and I think it's so important actually to speak so openly about our emotional situation very often, because it's so much about this, performance-driven aspect of startups and valuation and things like that. But what is actually needed in order to stay sane, basically, I think that's missing in the discussion a lot. So I appreciated a lot the input from Bas. But actually following up on that, so my crisis situation, contrary to the rest of the world, was basically pre-corona, because I founded a startup which was, the mission was clear. We wanted to have an alternative food structure for regional food producers, support family farms, support biodiverse systems. So in the terms, really rethink our food structures as a whole. And of course, with this big mission in my mind, and I'm always thinking about these holistic concepts, you don't really know where to start, because we started, as you were mentioning, with the digital platform. We were already found a really good opportunity to address the needs of the farmers. So I worked very detailed actually on their side, even with field studies, literally field studies, where we went to the farms and spent a day with them in order to understand their needs in terms of digitalization. But that wasn't enough up until Corona, because our customers, and that's, I think, the challenge all social or transforming or green businesses have, is that we're always measured against the status quo of large corporations. And basically what we were measured against was the cheap logistics of Amazon. Basically, you never pay anything for logistics at all. The intermediate reaction in terms of, customer service, of course, which is necessary, as well as also packaging times and delivery time slots. So on the one hand, we had a really good idea, which I think still was, or actually quite long time before, was appreciated by customers, but it was so challenging for us to meet their needs, because status quo was already so high in terms of customer convenience. So before Corona, I was, thinking and rethinking and thinking, okay, where do we have to really get the idea going? What's the product market fit? And basically, we did find out, doing a study with all of our customers who were interested, that they wanted everything in a box. They wanted everything within a few days of delivery, and that they didn't want to pay anything for the delivery. Basically, we had to fulfill that. And up until Corona, we did it, and we just, we worked on it, and it was small steps, and still, trying to understand the dynamics of a circular economy logistics system, actually, what we built on, because our way, what the product, the service we created, is actually also including the deposits of the packaging. So it's an exactly zero waste aspect of how to reorganize the food market now. But people were loving us, and nobody bought anything compared to, of course, the amount of press we did, compared to the talks I held. Everybody was really loving the product, but as soon as it comes to this very crucial point, which is behavioral change, and basically that's what I or markta actually had to fulfill, or was able to use this need during the Corona pandemic, because basically all of a sudden everybody's behavior changed from one day to another. The lockdown really made us rethink, on the one hand, how do we behave in terms of consumption patterns, but on the other hand, we're all at home, and all of a sudden there were different needs created. And it was quite interesting, because yes, it was definitely my most challenging year in terms of growth, but all of a sudden I didn't have a crisis anymore. Finally, I could actually fulfill the purpose of the business. And what I'm really proud of is not just the revenue that we made, but we were actually able to make a business for 150 Austrian family farms during the entire Corona crisis, when the lockdown happened, and they could actually not only survive, but triple their revenue in terms of sales from family farm products. So the interesting thing was, in a nutshell, crisis was before, because everybody loved us. Social businesses usually get this kind of attention, but as soon as it comes to actually paying higher prices, or making it a little bit less speedy in terms of delivery times, are those challenges that don't let you reach the mass market. And I think that was quite interesting for us to use the benefit of rethinking and different ideas during the Corona pandemic.
Mm-hmm. I think you touched upon some really interesting aspects here that I'd also like to come back to later, specifically with regards to that kind of behavioral change and what is needed to create that in people. We always think we can just tell people, look, this is how we should behave, and then people will behave like this. That's just not the case. But maybe also coming back to what Bas told us and what you said at the beginning, that it's so often we don't talk about how we're staying sane. How was it for you personally? Did you experience it as a kind of constant positive high, or how did you experience it? How did you deal with it?
So even during the growth phases, so when it was really, I don't know, incredible to last year, what kind of amount of food we were able to sell online. But for me as a person, I think on the one hand, I was relieved that we had so many orders. And of course, on the other hand, you work something like, I don't know, 60 to 80 hours per week. And my weekends, it was so challenging during that time because yes, I was hyped. And that's sometimes also a high risk. I think I'm definitely a person who is a kind of a high energy level. So my risk is even higher that I burn my energy too fast. And what actually really happened is that I worked so hard during the week that almost every Friday afternoon, I was knocked out, basically, not only crying because I was so stressed and just exhausted, but it took me really the entire weekend just to sleep and refill my energy. I couldn't really do anything socially, basically, for the entire years during the weekend, which is crazy because usually you use the weekend, to do something fun. And for me, it was this just knockout phase. And then on Monday, I was functioning again. And this is, of course, if you really have this purpose within yourself, it works, but it only really works to a certain amount of time. And what I can also agree with Bas is that the organizational structure is so important. So I'm definitely also not the operations girl per se. I love to do the big vision and strategy. And I think I'm really good also in terms of networking. And I think you have to understand also your personal qualities very detailed. What is like your core that you can bring to the company as a founder in that sense? And where do you need people? And for certain aspects, like the details of logistics, I just get overwhelmed and frustrated because every package that doesn't go right is like breaking my heart. And I definitely need people that are not so much emotionally detached with the products in a sense. Of course, also worship the quality and of course that's important, but still it's a difference there. And I think because I was able, and that was definitely my biggest relief after this big year, we had an investment round and I was able to really select carefully the people who are now invested in markta and who have a say in a certain way. I'm still having the majority of the shares, but nevertheless, it's very important now for me to have people to spar a little bit more. So I think it grew so organically, markta, to a certain level where, to be humble, I don't know how to scale to a certain degree anymore because I just need more outside experience in terms of strategy and scaling of business models with those logistics structures, for example, that I'm very happy that my investors now give me really good perspectives on what's needed next. And one of the things is building up a sustainable management board so that everybody's roles are defined, for example. This was much confusing during last year, and that was challenging.
Thank you so much also for sharing. I think it's beautiful how you're both open about those challenges. And I think it's also interesting how you're both describing that the business choices are so tightly connected to your personal well-being and that you just can't ignore those decisions that you just have to face at certain points.
I think just to round it up, I think it really depends on the personality and the methods you use in order to deal with your stress. So I think I'm getting more mature now, and I think I can, understand more where my value in terms of high energy output is and where I should put a little bit less energy in there, because not everything is equally important to get your energy as well. And I think it's much more about, also balancing your own energy household. So I think that has become my biggest learning over the last year, I think.
Great learning, specifically also with regards to energy. I think quite often people who have got high energy like you are perceived like they can do it all and, just go on like this Duracell rabbit. But just as you said, that also means that you're burning out quickly and you just have to make sure how to regain those energies. So thanks for that input. With this, I would also like to kind of smoothly go over to Ian. So Ian, you've been working with startups like Bas's and Theresa's for quite some time now, and you have probably experienced similar stories. I think each year you're consulting some 60 to 80 startups or even more at the moment. Yeah. So I'd be quite curious to hear from your perspective, what are the kind of biggest mistakes that happen to specifically the ones that are successful, and what's the advice that you give them so that they don't burn out? Or is that just that at some point to the successful ones, it just happens to all of us and then we just have to...
No, not at all. It's two very fascinating stories. First of all, delighted to be here today. And I am actually a customer of markta. and have been for some time, and would endorse what we heard earlier this morning, which is that you require social and cultural change in order to make this happen. I made the decision that it was okay to pay more. It was okay to accept slower deliveries because it was right. It was the right thing to do. And progressively, you see more and more of that going on. Today's millennials invest through their mobile phone predominantly in social things, in ESG investments. And that's a way that money starts to flow through to social enterprises, the like of which we've just been talking about. The two stories are remarkably similar and something that I encounter all the time. And there's a lovely story which I told you, Katharina, when we first spoke. There's three guys that go into it. This is a typical English joke. There's three guys that go into a bar from Imperial College, and they sit down one evening and say, let's start a business. It's a typical conversation at Imperial College. And one of them puts his hand up and says, it's my round. And oh, by the way, I'll be the CEO. He's 24 years old. He's never been a CEO in his life. He's never recruited someone. He's never fired someone. He's never raised any money. He's never done strategy before. But guess what? I'll run the company. And both of you, Bas and Theresa, told a very similar story. In the early days, the drive and energy you've got to make the business succeed is all about vision. That's where I want to take it. And the smart move, and it's not about doing anything wrong, but the smart move is to surround yourself very early with people that know how to execute. And that's what we specialize in doing. We find people who will invest very early in startup businesses when they're little more than a PowerPoint presentation, because they're passionate about exactly the same thing. They think, oh my God, that's exactly what needs to happen. I'll put a small amount of money in, forget the money's academic. The thing that's important is the skill set that they bring, whether that's in supply chain or logistics or legal, whatever the startup is. And without that, you get to where Bas and Theresa talk so eloquently, you get to burnout because you just don't have the bandwidth or the skill set to make that happen. And it was lovely to hear Bas talk about where he goes now with his new business, where he's already saying we've sat down and said we need to create a board with the right skill sets to make sure it happens, to be followed by Theresa saying I've now brought investors on board with the right skill sets to make sure it happens. To be a successful startup, you want to get to that point of having those skill sets as early in the game as you possibly can. And the difference is completely game changing. And back to a startup that I'm supporting right now, we've raised £350,000 for them. And we've got to the point where we've had to say to the CEO, the founder of the business, you're not investable. You're a really great visionary. You're doing a really super job and you're always going to be the major shareholder in the business. But we need to bring somebody in to run this business, which will take an awful lot of pressure off you and allow you to focus on the things that you're good at, but bring someone in who is investable for the future. So it's a completely circular way of taking businesses forward.
Circular. We're also talking about sustainability here, and what you also told me before we had as we had our previous conversation, you said that you see a trend in sustainable businesses. And I would find it quite interesting if you could tell our audience a bit about how you perceive that, because maybe people would have thought it's even more difficult for a social business or for sustainable business to get funding. And you probably both have also stories about this. But Ian, you said that it's actually getting quite trendy to invest into sustainable startups, into green startups. How are you perceiving that trend?
So you've got a massive change that's driven from the bottom end. So to raise money for a startup, somebody's got to put money into something first. And the way that happens traditionally is that you, Katharina, who've got a bit of spare money, go to your bank or to your financial advisor and say, I want to invest this, or I want to put it into a loan scheme, which will be invested on your behalf, a savings scheme, which will be invested on your behalf. When that happens, you might also say, and you know what, I'd like a parameter to be that this is invested in an ESG company, or into a green area. And we're seeing that more and more. The demand for
really,
ESG.
just kind of coming in to explain to, I know everyone's very much in the sector, but ESG is environmental, social, and governmental.
Thank you very much. Yes. Never use, I always say never use 3-letter acronyms, and I've just done that, haven't I? So you're seeing a huge demand for ESG investments to the point where it outstrips the supply. There aren't enough ESG investments. So now you get greenwashing. You get people saying, oh, actually, you know, what I'm doing is very green. I'll rewrite my business plan so it looks green just so I can raise money. And there are now rules and regulations emerging in the financial services industry which say you must do things properly. If you're claiming to be green, you must demonstrate that you're green so that when people invest in your business, they can really believe in it. And I touched on this earlier. Millennials are investing via their mobile phones. They have apps. It's so simple. And what are they doing? They're putting money into green businesses. So you now have fund managers managing that money saying, I need to find green investments. I need to find something green to put money into. It has become so much easier in the last 2 years for me to raise money in anything that's green than it ever was before. It's a complete reversal, because to the point that Theresa made earlier, when she started her business, it had a higher cost base, it was more expensive to use, and no one was therefore interested. You now get to a point where people say, I don't care if it's more expensive, I want to do that because it's the right thing to do. And we see more and more of that.
So I already have a few ideas on where I can then put my money into. Thanks for that. I'm having one look at the chat and there is plenty of questions. So Bas, I'd like to come back to you. You said before that it's quite difficult when you have to change the system from within. So that means you also have to get into the system, and you might have to work with the big players to be part of that system. So one question that came up in the chat by Sumita Sindhi is, how do you deal with the dilemma of scaling up and maintaining sustainable growth? Do you encounter the difficulty?
Yeah, of course. I mean, there's that difficulty. But I think, you know, especially with a startup and a scaling company where you're basically building a company, to be honest, it's much easier than changing a big corporate. I wasn't a big, you know, I had a discussion with one of the CEO of KLM, the Dutch Airlines. And we had a discussion about exactly this, and that's when he, at a certain point, he kind of, because I was kind of attacking him, like, you know, why don't you take a future where people fly less and take that as a given, and then start thinking about a business model around that. And as a startup, you can do that. You know, I can look at the future and I think like, okay, people fly less, it becomes a luxury. You know, that's my scenario, that's my vision, and let's make something that will fit that kind of future. And that's why he said to me, listen, Bas, it's actually a lot easier when you can start from scratch, when you want to deal with the big kind of problems of the future. Especially when you have to, you know, if you have to deal with all the legacy shit within your organization and within the economic system, you know, it becomes really difficult. When you just look at the startup in that way, it becomes much brighter kind of setting, because it means that within the startup, even though you have to deal with a lot of the legacy stuff that's happening within that system that you don't want to have, but you want to change, you can really work towards that future. If your business model works now, it will definitely work for the future, because that's what you're aiming for with your business model. And that is, you know, that's a great thing about setting up a startup. I wouldn't say it's the easier route, but for, you know, than changing big corporates, because, you know, I think everyone has its own kind of, you know, I'm just happen to be good at setting up new stuff. I'm not too good at changing something that's already there. So for me, that's the logical route. And I think it appeals to a lot of people that want to create change in the world. And I think a startup in that sense, especially, you know, a social enterprise is a great way to change to really at the root of the system, our economic system, create change. And it's kind of, I've said before, like it's we're hippies with a business plan, and I think that is, that's the way to really look at it.
So if you're the kind of hippie with the business plan and the free flying bird in a cooperation with the corporate, what is it that in that cooperation you can also learn from the corporate maybe as a startup? How does that work?
A lot. I mean, and that's especially, and Ian is right. You get people in at a certain point when your company is scaling, and Fairphone is not a scaling mode, and that's where corporates really make the difference. And it's about people know how to make decisions. Can you imagine that in a company where everybody is intrinsically connected, with everything the company is doing, decision making becomes very difficult. And that's, it's passionate, but it's also one of the things you're dealing with when you're setting up a social enterprise. People want to be part of the decision making because it's really, there's so much connected to the goal and the mission of the company, and that is great. But it also means that you will have to put structures in place, and corporates are really good at that, in which decision making is also a part of the operating system of the company. So I wouldn't say that the corporate structure works in a startup or in a scale up, but it's definitely a different perspective that really helps also scaling these companies. And I've seen that change also within Fairphone, and I applaud it as well, because it really it's a new phase of the company. I think it's part of growing up.
So coming back from working together with corporations to first working with your own customers, Theresa, you first said that you found it quite difficult that people kind of look for convenience first, and it's quite difficult to change their behavior. So in a way, that crisis worked in your favor somehow. And I'm looking also at the chat at one of the questions was, how could you get the farmer families to cooperate with you and believe in your project? So it's one, probably a group of stakeholders that you have to deal with the customers and try to change their behavior. But what about the farmers? How did you experience that?
That was quite easy. I was actually also writing in the chat about it because it's so interesting. I think let's talk about both aspects for a quick summary, because I think what is different with Fairphone, and I think that's very interesting also in terms of, having a business model what really can sustain at the point now will sustain in the future. I think the challenge that we sometimes have is the different patterns how we consume. And for our product, it's definitely something which is highly embedded in terms of I go to the supermarket like 2 or 3 times per week even. And that's like a routine that has to be changed. That's why I think for us, I highly underestimated this behavioral change, to be honest. And I think it's important also when founding something new to understand the regularity of the customer or the change behavior that is needed. If it's like a one time or regular time, it's quite different actually on the consumer side. That's why I thought our challenge was quite different on the customer side. But on the other hand, on the producer side, it was so much easier than I expected. Because basically at the moment in Austria, there's 2,500 family farms closing every year. So I'm 30 years old, and my lifetime period was really, it halved the amount of farms in Austria, which of course led to this monopole structures in that sense that only a few of those who tried to scale actually survive. So that was our part, which was easier than I actually expected eventually, because I think during the Corona pandemic, in the first 2 weeks of the lockdown, we got 600 further registrations from family farms because their need was so high. And I think that's interesting. At the beginning, I actually wanted to revolve the business model around the need of the farmers. And that's, again, something highly challenging now, understanding who's the beneficiary of your product and who is the payee. Sometimes that's that's not the same thing, because yes, the farmers are our beneficiaries, but I do also understand, because they're suffering at the moment quite a lot because they don't have the turnover in order to survive. It was also very difficult to make them the payees of the business model. At the beginning, we had like marketing packages for them or different versions on how to actually support them in order to professionalize. But it was quite interesting that just, getting them as suppliers, no challenge at all, but actually getting them as the basis of your business model didn't work. And I think that's also sometimes interesting in rethinking new business models. Who's like the shareholders in terms of, who benefits from the product, and who's the stakeholders in the larger sense. And maybe it's not sometimes the same person who benefits, but also that pays for that. And I think that was definitely one of my bigger challenge in order to get to the business model where we're at the moment, so that the customers are actually, understanding that the added value that we gain for them, that we bundle the products from different farmers and actually guarantee a high quality as well as high sustainability. But eventually the beneficiaries are basically the farmers. And I think that's also interesting how that will change even in the future of markta's business models. Maybe we're even going towards a membership program where there's really a direct contribution, because I do believe that we also need to rethink economic structures as a whole and not just build up digital business models if you don't have the basis that actually, makes us change in the larger sense.
You're already guiding the way, as I will unfortunately have to wrap up soon. But to the final question, the final round that I'd like to do as well. When you said before that that the kind of wanting convenient products, convenient services was somehow in the way of your service at the beginning, what's your outlook in the future, specifically when we look at the kind of new generation that's coming? Do you think convenience is still in the way of sustainability, or will there be a shift?
I actually loved Ian's statement about the new generation, because I do believe that's exactly also my biggest hope and belief, that as soon as you're talking to I don't know, teenagers at the moment, and they are already so differently educated and aware about structures than I was. And I don't feel that much older in the sense of, okay, maybe it's like 15 years or 10 years. It's like so close to me, but nevertheless, their way of understanding exceeds actually a lot of the knowledge that I gained doing school education. So I'm extremely hopeful on that end. And yes, we will definitely follow the strategy that speed is not everything. And it's not just about this growing faster and scaling in the classical sense of venture capital. And I think that was one of the other questions that popped up quite early. It's the combination of sustainability as well as growth. And to be honest, I haven't answered it yet. I'm just extremely hopeful and optimistic that the future is ours in the sense of the many generations that will follow. And I do believe that maybe I don't have the clue and the result to everything at the moment, that it's the most biggest part of success is actually hanging in there sometimes, which is sometimes a little bit lonesome, but it actually works. It's interesting.
Thank you so much. We already heard today that sometimes we need more solutions to then make sure that somehow we'll find our way to the right ones. And you've definitely proven that you've got that high amount of energy to follow some of those solutions. Ian, one question that also came up in the chat quite often is, how can you actually prepare future social entrepreneurs? What is the kind of skill set that they need to learn in business schools to better be prepared for these kind of challenges?
I mean, the circumstances don't change regardless of whether you're trying to do something that's inherently dirty or inherently clean. If you've got a green business, you still need to make sure that the principles of running that business work. And what we've heard from Bas and from Theresa underline that point very strongly. What is happening, regardless of any input from people like me, is that as youngsters, millennials come through the education system, they are becoming greener and greener. They recognize that we've got to change what we do to make this planet work properly. That will feed through to their investment decisions. It will feed through to their business startups. It will make them buy products from people like Theresa because they want to do it right. So it's going to happen anyway. And get on the bandwagon, because if you don't and you're trying to do something dirty, you're going to get left behind. This is a steam train coming down the track. That's not a steam train, it's an electric train now, I suppose.
Thank you so much. And with this, as I have to end, Bas, I would ask you maybe for a final comment. We've talked about highs today, we've talked about lows today. Are you sharing the optimism of Theresa and Ian when it comes to sustainable transformation? You're already working on your next startup in that direction. How hopeful are you?
Well, I'm super hopeful. Otherwise, I wouldn't be doing this. But yeah, it's definitely also the I've come to a low point where I really had to get my girlfriend to get me to the mental health clinic at the crisis center. So I got to a low. But I also got a high where they closed down whole Fifth Avenue and I was having dinner with somebody and I thought it was like a terrorist attack, but it was actually because of my dinner I was having with Al Gore at the moment. So it's like a roller coaster. And if people ask me, just going back and they hear all these stories, me and my chopper in Congo and dealing with the in China with the CEOs of big factories just negotiating about unions and that kind of stuff. It's a fun ride, and I wouldn't have want to miss any moment of it, even the downsides. And I've learned from it. And the only thing is I can't keep doing this forever. So in my new startup, I take doing it a bit slower. And I think Theresa was right. You have to balance that. And if you find that balance, and that goes with age as well and experience, I think I can keep doing this for a while. And I love doing it. I wouldn't want to do it differently.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Bas. Thank you, Theresa. Thank you, Ian. You all said now in one way or the other, it's not always about speed. It's also about slowing down, maybe in this roller coaster that success can be, in this constant up and down. And I think that is just what life is. But I like it that you're all still hopeful and optimistic that we're going to find our way towards sustainability. So I think this session has left us all very passionate and hopeful and optimistic. Thank you so much for sharing also your personal stories.